Today is September 30th, 2025, and my guest is Angus Fletcher of Ohio State University, where he is professor of story science. His latest book, which is the subject of today's episode, is Primal Intelligence. You are smarter than you know. Angus, welcome to EconTalk.
I'm excited to be here. I'm a big fan of the pod.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I'm a big fan of your book. It is bristling with interesting ideas, techniques for, and applications of slightly off the beaten track way of approaching life and thinking. So let's start with your claim that we've misdefined intelligence. What do you mean by that? What does that mean, misdefined intelligence?
So in the modern world, we've almost entirely defined intelligence as some form of logic, and logic is basically data-driven decision-making. So the idea is that you can only be intelligent if you've got all the facts and you analyze those facts rationally and then arrive at the conclusion objectively that everybody else would arrive at. And I don't have any problem with facts and I don't have any problem with reason, but the problem is that most of the time in life, you don't have enough information to use logic. And in fact, the human brain evolved in environments which, because of the nature of biological evolution, were constantly changing. Information was very fragile, was shifting. And so the human brain had to develop intelligence that was able to operate in low information environments. And that's the intelligence that I'm interested in studying in the book. That's the intelligence that comes out of my own background in neuroscience and my belief in the ways that humans think differently from computers. And that's what I essentially mean by primal intelligence.
So I didn't go into your biography. I rarely do. But before we start, I introduced you as a professor of story science, which sounds like an oxymoron. But as you mentioned just now, you have a background in neuroscience, and much of the book draws on your interactions with the military folks in special operations. Give us a couple of minutes just about your own background and experience and how it came to inform the book.
Yeah, so my origin story goes back to neuroscience. Neuroscience means a lot of things today, including psychology. I do not do psychology. Psychology is essentially a logical way of thinking about the brain in terms of constructs and then testing those constructs through various forms of quantitative measurement, like you might do on MTurk or something like that. I'm interested in the hardware of the human brain. I'm interested in how neurons work physically. I'm interested in how neurons are incredibly complicated, more complicated than we're able to fully understand at the moment. And I'm interested in how that complexity allows the brain to do things that are obviously different from what computers can do. So my background starts with the fact that the human brain is intelligent in ways we don't fully understand, but that intelligence allows us to innovate. That intelligence allows us to anticipate the future. That intelligence allows us to think like other people who are not ourselves. That intelligence allows us to do a lot of really interesting things that for various reasons computers can't do. So that's my background. My background is in that kind of neuroscience understanding of the complexity of the physical hardware of the human brain. And one of the things that I came to believe is that human intelligence is characterized by the ability to make plans. So if you can make a plan, and if you can make a new plan, you can handle new situations. And what we're seeing today is a crisis, particularly among young people, an inability to make new plans. When they don't know what to do, they turn to somebody else for advice. And whenever you're doing that, you're taking a plan off the shelf. And so you're making it impossible for yourself to succeed in a new environment. Because I can tell you something, your parents don't understand how to succeed today. Your parents succeeded yesterday. They don't have a plan that's going to work today.
Don't tell my children that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Unfortunately, it's something I got to tell my children all the time, right? They're always asking me for advice. And I'm like, I'm clueless. And I think that, more professors and more parents could help kids out by being honest and saying, I was really smart yesterday and today is different. And I can teach you the way that I got to be smart. But the answers that I have in my head are not the answers going to work for you. So we know that human ability to come up with new plans is a driver of intelligence. It's not all of intelligence, but it's a driver of intelligence. It's something that computers can't do, and it's something that's not taught in school. So it's something that I wanted to understand. And what is a plan? Well, a plan is a plot, is a narrative. In other words, a plan is a sequence of actions. And a new plan is a new sequence of actions. It's a new story about the future. And so I thought to myself, what I want to do is I want to understand how the brain invents new narratives. And so I thought to myself in my youthful naivete that I would go get a PhD in Shakespeare, because obviously people in English departments must know a lot about narratives and inventing new stories. And as I discovered when I got into English departments, that's not what people do in English departments. People in English departments actually apply various forms of philosophy to literature and interpret it, which is basically what a computer would do to literature. They don't sit around trying to think, how do I invent new plans? But I did that. I was a little bit of a maverick, a little bit of rogue. I hung in there. I stayed in. I got my PhD at Yale, went on to Stanford, started connecting with people like Pixar, who actually did invent new stories, moved on, worked a lot in Hollywood, got a job as a professor there at the University of Southern California, spent a lot of time working with creatives. And then I moved to Ohio State, which has something called Project Narrative, which is the world's leading academic institute for the study of narrative. And I'm kind of the world's expert really in the neuroscience of narrative, this very kind of tiny branch, which I almost invented, which is how stories actually work in animal neurons.
I want you to say something about the military, but before you do, I want to say a couple things about the book so we do not deter readers. There is a little neuroscience in the book, but it's not, there's no pretense, which I love. There's no pretense that this book is based on neuroscience. It's based on your very, very wide range of experiences thinking about this and applying the insights to real world situations. So I really love that. So, but talk about the military.
Yeah, and just on that book part, I mean, I've produced a ton of academic publications which are completely impenetrable to everybody, and possibly I'm speaking impenetrably now. But I've also worked a lot of my life in Hollywood working on screenplays. And the book is essentially like a screenplay. It's written as a series of little kind of anecdotes and plot twists and characters, the job of which is to stimulate your imagination, your intuition, your common sense, all the parts of the human brain that are able to fire in ways that computers can't. So the military. So basically, I'm this wacky academic who has this background in neuroscience, who believes that somehow the secret to cracking human intelligence is to understand how narratives work. And I've been locked up essentially in an English department, publishing these books and articles that nobody is really reading because nobody pays any attention to academics. And then I get a knock on my door from the U.S. Army, and in particular from U.S. Army Special Operations. And they basically come in and they say, hey, Professor Fletcher, we know you're a little bit of a maverick. We know a lot of people out there think you're a little bit nuts. But we've been reading your work, and it really tracks with almost everything that we think. And furthermore, your emphasis on planning is really interesting to us because that's what we have to do. We have to make plans in special operations. We have to come up with a plan for dealing with a new situation. And then the moment we jump out of our helicopters, that plan is smashed by unpredictable events, and we've got to make new plans. So we've got to train our special operators to be new planners. We've got to equip them with this ability that no matter what life throws at them, they can make a new plan. And what's exciting about your work, Professor Fletcher, is it has a theory about how the human brain makes new plans. But it's a theory you've never really tested because no one's given you the money to test it. So how would you like to come inside U.S. Army Special Operations, and we'll give you all the money in the world to test your theory so you can see if you were wrong or possibly if you were right.
And much of the book, there are all those vignettes and narratives that you mentioned earlier about many, many great figures from history and fascinating individuals. Many are known, many not known. But at the same time, there is a running theme of special operations needing to, and often testing or using, or you learning from them, how to plan. But I want to make sure that listeners, again, don't get turned off by that phrase, how to plan. I hate planning, and for the reasons you do, which is that I think people actually believe, which is, I think, a fundamental error, that if you want to get somewhere, you have to make a plan. And so you do, and then the idea is to stick with it and persist and never give up and be an optimist and believe in it. Positive thinking, which maybe we'll talk about later, is something you're not a big fan of, as well as I am also not a big fan of that. And anybody who hears those stories or that encouragement to plan has it at some point. Anybody who's had some real world experience has your reaction, which is your truth. I would say not your reaction, your truth. Plans break down immediately. And I think one of the virtues of the book is to help you understand both how to respond to that, because reality is a mess and you've got all this information, plan A, and situations changing, and you have to make decisions on the fly. So I would say the book's not about planning. It's about thinking on the fly when you don't have a lot of data. And in particular, when you might have a bunch of misleading data from the past, like talking to your parents about what's going to work in this situation. Well, they're clueless because most of the time. And even if they weren't clueless, them telling you what to do is not going to help you much because you kind of need to figure it out for yourself. But say a little bit about this idea of why it's worthwhile to plan, even though the plan is smashed as soon as your helicopter lands. Because then you could, most people would say, well, then that was obviously a mistake. You should have done it. Why would you plan if it's not going to work out?
So no plan survives contact with the enemy, which is why centralized planning is always a mistake, which is why you always have to decentralize planning to the people on the ground who are able to more rapidly adapt and evolve as the situation itself evolves. The reason you plan is to become a better planner. So this is a core thing that kind of goes to the book, actually comes from Dwight Eisenhower. And Dwight Eisenhower says that basically what you do before any military operation is you make a plan for everything you can imagine happening. You think, what if my enemy does this? What if my enemy does this other thing? What if I have this unexpected breakthrough? What if I have this unexpected challenge? You make plans, you make plans, you make plans, you make plans, you make plans. And then the moment the battle starts, you throw out all the plans and you just focus on what's happening now. And so to your point, why'd you spend time planning? Well, the purpose of planning is to develop the planner, not to develop the plan. In other words, it's to make you better able at inventing new courses of action on the fly. And the more you practice doing that under pressure. So the classic way that special operations pitches its training is role play with real bullets. So in other words, you're constantly imagining different situations that could happen, but you're doing it with guns going off around you, so you feel like you might die. So it's that combination of imagination, but also real world pressure that forces the mind to come up with practical plans, whatever we want to call them, courses of action, thoughts on the fly, that allow you to shift your situation to your advantage in that moment and force your adversary or force your environment to either push back or give way. And so the entire point of the book is that we have set up a school system right now, which is essentially doing the opposite for students. It's giving them questions that the teachers already know the answer to. And what then happens is that students learn there is an answer and the system has it. And when I'm uncertain about life, what I should do is I should look around for a book or an authority who can tell me what to do. That's the entire conditioning that happens in our school system. Whereas the reality of life is there almost never is an answer. I mean, life comes without an answer. I mean, that's why it's terrifying, but that's also why it's beautiful, because it gives you the opportunity for your own individuality, your own originality, your ability to craft your own path. And even if there is an answer, it's very unlikely that the teacher has it. The answer, such as it exists in your own initiative. And so a huge part of the book is encouraging individuals to take the initiative when they're in uncertain environments and learn through feedback. So when you make a plan, that plan comes with a set of expectations as to what will result from you enacting that plan. When things start to go sideways, what your brain then has to do is start to make other plans. And successful planners are always able to imagine multiple possibilities for life. So a successful planner isn't locked in on a single narrative. This is why I think narrative has a bad rap among economists, as a lot of economists will say, well, the problem with narrative is you have this narrative in your head, and then you interpret the data that you get to fit your narrative. That's a misuse of narrative. Narrative did not evolve in the human brain for its truth function or its probability function. Narrative evolved in the human brain for its possibility function, for its ability to imagine new things that haven't occurred yet. And so you're being an effective planner when you're able to imagine all sorts of things that haven't happened to you or haven't happened to anybody else, increasing the possibility space, flexing your imagination. And so, to get back to your original question, the purpose of planning ahead of time is to increase your sense of all the different possibilities that could happen in your environment and all the possible actions that you could take, so that when you hit that moment of impact, you have the maximum intellectual flexibility.
You know, there are many movies. It's a cliche where a character who's an ignoramus or vulnerable or inept or simply not skilled is paired with a super skilled person I'm going to reveal something embarrassing. One of my favorite movies, and I call it an airplane movie because my standards are lower on an airplane, and I want a certain set of escapist pleasure. One of my favorite movies is Night and Day with Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz. And I think in that movie, but it's in a lot of movies, a character like Cameron Diaz, who's an amateur, is with a pro like Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is the pro's pro. He can solve any problem. And at one point, somebody always turns to the pro and says, so what's the plan? And we, of course, as the audience, are expecting an answer. We're going to scooch around here. And sometimes they whisper it into the character's ear to keep some suspense. There's usually some plot reason they have to whisper it. But in a lot of these movies, there's this moment where the main character says, I don't have a plan. Or they're just kind of pause. And the vulnerable, less skilled person goes, you don't have a plan? What do you mean you don't have a plan? And of course, we know it almost always turns out fine. But what's fun about what you just said is that that's actually a virtue. Of course, you don't have a plan for this new thing that just surprised them. They fell out of this thing that they were supposed to be in, or they suddenly have to confront some new threat. But what's the plan? Well, we don't have one. So that's life. It's what that's called. And it's a very, I'm never going to look at those moments again the same way.
Yeah. So, by the way, thanks for that deep cut on Night and Day. I actually got to read that script before the movie was made. And I also am a secret fan of the script, at least. Let me just say that. To your point, I have a whole thing in there about expertise. And there's a chapter, actually, which is based on the idea of unleash the rookie. And this comes from this work.
Let's talk about that, because I love that.
So Unleash the Rookie comes from me working with these special operations pilots. And I was asking these operation pilots how it is they get better, because they're already the best in the world. They are literally the expert of experts. People come to them to learn and figure out how to fly these elite planes in the most challenging of situations. And so I said to them, how do you get better? And they say, what I do is I hand the controls over to someone who is a rookie. In other words, somebody who knows enough to think that they're better than they are. I hand the controls over to them. I say, oh, okay, that's interesting. And then what? Like the rookie does something brilliant that you weren't expecting that suddenly teaches you about, how the airplane can fly better. And they're like, no. What the rookie does is the rookie makes a mistake. And then, what I want to do as the expert is I want to correct that mistake, but I don't. I let the rookie make that mistake, and then I let the rookie make another mistake, and then another mistake. And pretty soon, the rookie has chained together so many mistakes that I'm starting to feel very stressed. My adrenaline level is going up. Why? Because I'm in a situation that I've never seen before. This plane is flying upside down. This helicopter is going backwards. Something is happening that I've never seen before. And that puts this pressure on me and my expertise to figure out a new solution to this problem. And so the value of the rookie is the rookie introduces uncertainty into my training process that I would never get in a flying simulator. And so I use rookies in order to pull out the deeper expertise of myself.
And what I love about that, well, there's a couple things. One, you talk about how when you're an expert, you're overconfident and you figure, I don't have to learn anything. I'm the best. And actually can be a fatal mistake. But the idea that you would let the rookie dig a deep enough hole that you've never been that deep, and now you're going to be tested to your limit. And if selection bias problem here, if you survive that mistake, that chain of mistakes, you have gained something deep and powerful for the next time, or a situation something like it, or a horrible situation, but not as bad as that one. So you keep your cool all the way through.
Yeah, and you've developed your ability to realize, I don't know what I'm doing, but I will figure it out. Because what we discovered with these pilots who are really successful is when they get into these crisis moments, the first thought they have in their brain is, I've been in a crisis situation before and I figured it out. And that immediately calms down your brain and allows it to online its full intelligence. And the thing that we discovered about working with these special operations pilots is they don't just get in the cockpit and then allow a rookie to chain together 400 mistakes in a row and then try and get out of it. The first time they let the rookie take over, the rookie chains together 3 or 4 mistakes. And then the expert takes over the controls. And then they're like, you know what? I can handle 3 or 4 mistakes. Next time I'll let them make 5 or 6 mistakes, and then 7 or 8 mistakes. And so what you're doing as an expert is you're constantly pushing to your own limits, and you're constantly exploring that. And what you start to realize is that your expertise is deeper than you think it is, because expertise is conservative by nature. Experts like to go into areas that they understand, and they like to display their dominance. And by doing so, they forget that they started out outside their zone of competence. And so what you have to do as an expert is constantly push yourself back to that moment when you were a learner, a beginner, which is uncomfortable for you as an expert, but it is actually the source of your own strength and your own intelligence. And to your point, you don't want to push so far that you crash the airplane. But if you're an expert, you're probably a faster learner than you think you are.
I can't help but think about a quarterback in football, American football, who's under very intense pressure, makes a lot of mistakes, or his teammates make mistakes. And it's kind of a weird tension. I don't know if you've thought about it, I bet you have. You know, football is choreographed beyond imagining. The incredible set of plays that are repeated over and over and over again, to the point where, you know, Bill Belichick's mantra, when he was a good coach, was do your job. Meaning you don't have to innovate, figure out, freelance. We've got that all figured out. You're just a pawn, and we've prepared you for these situations so you can be an effective pawn with all the other pawns. But we also understand that great athletes in that situation, especially a quarterback who's in an probably unique situation compared to the other players, has to process information at very high speeds. The 17 mistakes have been made, and it's a very small window before the helicopter crashes, before they're sacked, or before they throw an interception, or they're stripped of the ball. So it's an interesting. Great quarterbacks slow down time. Great athletes, time is in slow motion. Action's in slow motion for them. And I assume that's also true for those helicopter pilots. And it comes from a lot of practice. Some of it's native, intuitive skills, but a lot of it comes from having seen many, many different situations many, many times.
Yeah, so I actually worked quite a bit with NFL quarterbacks for this book. And NFL quarterbacks, I think, are perhaps an even more relatable example than helicopter pilots, because with a helicopter pilot, you're essentially trying to fly against this inhuman environment. I mean, that's what you're facing. As a quarterback, what you're trying to do is you're trying to break your opponent. And that means you actually don't have to play perfectly to win the game. You just have to play in a way that your opponent can't handle. And what wins in any competitive environment is always surprise. If you can surprise the other person, you throw them off their game.
Yeah, the plans
you seize the initiative. You see this all the time when you're watching. Professional sporting matches. And at some point, one of the commentators will be like, "Oh, this team has just quit. This team has just quit. Why have they quit?" And the answer is, well, they haven't quit physically, because these individuals are the most in shape athletes in history. What's happened is they've given up on the plan. They don't know what to do. And when they look at their coach doesn't have any new ideas. And they realize we're just going to keep trying the same approach over and over again, whether that's football, whether that's soccer, whether that's tennis, whether that's whatever, right? We're cooked because our opponent has broken our plan and has given us something we can't deal with. And so to your point about great quarterbacks are often thought of as being these kinds of hyper algorithmic computational processors where,
Yeah, that's right.
The coach draws up all these different kinds of, different routes on the field. And the quarterback's job is to figure out, is the safety here or is the safety there, so on and so forth. But the reality is once you actually get into the NFL, that's not how it works, because the defense is disguising itself. The information that you see is actually obsolesced immediately by all the people that are moving. Your eyes can only be in a narrow part of the field at once, So actually what you need to do is you need to seize the initiative by all of a sudden identifying a vulnerability in the defense that they weren't seeing and then attacking it violently. And then the moment you do that, you start to scramble your opponent. Their decisions start to come slower. Their confidence that they can anticipate your play starts to fall. And then you start to be able to get away with even bad plays because you've got your opponent overthinking and overanalyzing and being concerned, where's the next surprise coming from? And so even just that little bit of danger that's introduced by a quarterback who can violently identify and exploit an unexpected vulnerability is enough a lot of the time to win the game.
talk about the toddler who loses her spoon and you replace it with the same spoon and they can't handle it. And why that's an interesting story.
Yeah. So when I was a young dad, I had my then 6-month-old daughter. I took her out on a little backyard picnic, which I think is an experience many parents have. Took out with me a little jar of carrot puree, and then just a bunch of plastic spoons to feed her with. And so started out, gave her a little spoonful of the carrot puree. She grabbed the spoon in her hand, tried to feed herself, messed up, dropped the spoon. And I thought, oh, no big deal. Here, I've got another spoon. Dad came prepared, pulled out another spoon out of the box, put that in the carrot puree, gave it to her, and she just burst into tears and wouldn't accept the spoon. And I was like, what's going on? And finally, as I kept trying to give her the spoon and she kept rejecting it, I suddenly realized, oh, she doesn't want this spoon that I'm giving her. She wants her original spoon. Because she feels like somehow I'm cheating her by trying to give her this new spoon, like I'm engaged in some kind of like racket or something. So I go, no, look. And I picked up the spoon from the grass and the new spoon that I was giving her, and I held them up side by side. And I said, look, these are identical plastic spoons. They've been mass produced in exactly the same factory. There's nothing different about them. And I held them up in front of her, and she looked in them both, and she grabbed the original spoon and was happy. And I was like, what is going on? And I never understood this moment until I started working with special operators. And special operators said to me, well, what that revealed is the brain's default setting. When you are born, your default setting is to believe that everything in the world is unique. Every person is unique. Every plastic spoon is unique. Everything is, which they are. In reality, they actually are. And that's what allows you to identify new opportunities. Because by cherishing things as special and unique, you're able to go past your stereotypes and your snap judgments of them, the kind of patterns that you formed, and instead say, what is different here that could lead to a different future? And what happens as we get older is that sort of belief that everything is unique is slowly replaced with an efficiency process where we want to kind of get on with life and we want to kind of maximize on the patterns that we've seen. We want to become more productive. And so we start getting much faster at judgments. We start saying, oh, what, that person, I've seen that person before. I know exactly that kind of person. I know what they're doing. Of course, all spoons are the same. It doesn't matter. Just give me a spoon, and so on and so forth. And by doing so, we, of course, miss out on the kind of pleasure and joy of discovery. But as the special operators pointed out to me, we also miss out on opportunities. Because in fact, there's lots of things around us right now that our mind is just skipping past because we think, oh, I've seen that before. When actually we haven't. There's something new about that that's revealing an emergent possibility for the future. And so a huge part of what operators do is they train themselves to be able to turn on that childlike brain, to be able to spot what's unique about things in order to detect these pathways, these possible opportunities. And what special operators call that is they call that detecting the exceptional or exceptional information. Something about a familiar object that is different or new in some way. You've met 100 bankers, but then all of a sudden this banker is slightly different. Even though they're dressed the same as all the other bankers, they say something which makes you realize, this banker sees the market slightly differently. Maybe I should talk to this guy a little bit, Or you get up and you see the way that, copper prices are going, and, you suddenly realize, the pattern that I expect in commodities is a little bit different today. Let me pause on this and see if there's maybe some kind of underlying shift in the fundamentals of the market that I wouldn't have seen if I just dismissed this as a pattern.
And, there's a tension here, of course. It's an incredibly beautiful thing that your daughter saw those two spoons as different. And as you pointed out, it's incredibly inefficient. Can be paralyzing. Again, figure which one's better, or which one. And as adults, it's an incredibly powerful skill to categorize things, see those patterns. But at the same time, you miss a lot. And so there's a trade-off, a tension between generalization, I would call it, and treasuring the exception. And it's, I think, it's a really important, just being aware of that is an incredibly useful skill, I think, in marriage, friendship, management. You get an employee who's, and you think, and your brain does this without you realizing it. Oh, she's just like that woman we hired before, and she was awful. Or she's just like that woman, she was phenomenal. And it's, they are unique. No two spoons really are alike. And at the same time, sometimes it's very useful to say that one's off the table because we know that's a bad habit that person has. It's not going to be useful for working here. So it's a very interesting just mind experience to keep those two things going at the same time.
Yeah, no, and I think you've expressed it beautifully, is that we do have a tendency, I think, to jump to stereotypes about people too quickly. But, if I spent 45 minutes trying to figure out which plastic spoon to use every time I went to a fast food restaurant, how much of my life would I be wasting? And so the key insights are, first of all, we're now entering a world where computers are ubiquitous. And computers are much better at pattern matching and efficiency than humans are. And we're going to see this a lot with artificial intelligence and AI. So in the past, one of the edges for certain humans in terms of being successful in life was their ability to spot patterns faster than other humans. But that power is increasingly being shifted from us onto machines. And so what makes us distinct as humans is actually our ability to do the opposite. So one thing just to keep in mind for people is that the more the computers become prevalent, the more that your ability to spot what's unique is going to be what helps you get ahead. Because a computer, by nature, skips over exceptions or regresses them to the mean. The other thing is what's really critical is the ability to toggle back and forth between these two. So children just can't help themselves. Children can't go into an efficiency cycle. Children can't have a conversation in which they're like, yes, the two spoons are the same, And most adults have the opposite problem, where they can't have a conversation about, wait, these two spoons are different? What are you talking about? That's a waste of my time. And if you ask most adults to slow down and try and spot exceptions, there have been a ton of studies. We have a bunch of studies here at Ohio State that have done this, trying to get adults to slow down and see what's unique about things. Kids spot many, many orders more exceptions than adults do. So the key as an adult is your ability to get back to your childhood self without losing your adult self. So you hone that switch as opposed to just reverting to childhood.
You have a very entertaining and strange story about being interviewed by the special operators. Special operators, by the way, are not on the telephone service. They're working in special operations. Operators is the noun for that person. Talk about when you were interviewed and their focus on exceptions. What were they looking for?
So to your point, they were trying to decide whether there was something special about me. Was I a special spoon or was I like every other spoon in the drawer? And the way this came about is, after they contacted me, they essentially got me in a car, drove me for 6 hours to this undisclosed location, put me in this room with no windows, and told me that I was about to take a lie detector test. And so like everyone else who's a civilian who's ever been told they're going to take the lie detector test, I thought I was going to get hooked up to some machine that was going to sort of, measure various electrical signals and like bleep out of it. And I was getting kind of, nervous about this. Yeah. Exactly, yeah. And instead, what happens is three people just walk into the room basically wearing boots and jeans and just sit down in folding chairs. And they're like, we're your lie detector test. And I was like, okay. And then they start asking me these really simple, easy questions, like, are you married? What high school did you go to? These kinds of things, you know what I mean? And I start to relax. And
you're really good at those. You're killing it.
Yeah, I'm just like, no lying here, right? The moment that happens, all of a sudden one of them leans forward to me and he goes, your accent is fake. And I was like, what? He's like, your American accent. That's fake. That's a fake accent that you're talking with. And when he said that, I almost had a heart attack because first of all, this is true. I do have a fake American accent. I'm not sure if any of your listeners have gotten onto this, but I've gone through, I've talked to tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. No one's ever been like, your accent is fake. And so I sort of had this panic attack and I was like, oh my God, I hope they don't, assassinate me in this room because they think I'm a Russian spy or something. And so I just blurted out. I'm like, well, I was born in England. But I came to this country and so, that's how I lost my accent. There was a long pause and then they leaned forward and they're like, that's not actually true because we can tell you didn't lose your accent slowly and naturally over time, the way you would if you had just immigrated to this country. We can tell you intentionally lost your accent, like you were trying to conceal where you came from. And then they just lean back in these chairs and look at me. And again, I'm having this panic attack because this is completely true. This is actually what happened. And again, it makes me sound like I'm a spy, right? Like who intentionally loses their accent? Spies. And so I had this flash. Yeah, that's right. That's right. And so I had this flashback and I was like, how do I explain this to them? And the true story is, I came to this country as a child. I had this English accent. I went to school. I got bullied a lot for my accent because, that's how kids are. It wasn't like a super traumatic experience, but, it's just kind of
Unpleasant.
Growing up. It was unpleasant, And, I think like a lot of people, particularly maybe like a lot of people, who have a little bit of a stubborn streak, I was like, I'm not going to let this bullying get to me. And so I just leaned into having this accent. And so I very proudly had this accent, after I'd stopped being bullied, and I'm now like 12, 13, 14, 15. I still have this accent. And, the day comes I'm about to go to college, and it just occurs to me, it's ridiculous that I have this English accent because I've lived in America most of my life. The first thing that anyone ever says to me when they meet me is, oh, you're English. And I'm like, no, not really. I'm American. This is odd, So I just thought to myself, like, it's time for me to lose this accent. And so over the summer between high school and college, I just intentionally lost my accent, and I went to college to be my real self with this fake accent. So anyway, I'm thinking all this. And then I'm like, this is nuts. Like, I'm going to explain to these guys that I lost my accent. I have a fake accent so I could be my real self, which is being an American when I'm not really an American. Like, what is that? So anyway, I finally fumble out this story to them, and they just accept it immediately, and they move on. And when I finally passed the interview, and they're like, you haven't been lying. You've told us the truth the whole time. We clear you to kind of study our teams. I was like, how did you? I mean, that was like the craziest story that I ever told about why I lost my accent. How did you know? And they were basically like, the truth is stranger than fiction, which is another way of saying that actually reality is more unexpected than you can imagine a lot of the time. And in general, that you're at least in a place where there's a possible truth when it surprises you. And when you hear something that's formulaic or like something you've heard before, that's actually more likely to be a cover story. That's actually more likely to be something that's made up or to be a lie. And so the key actually about life is it's a series of surprises or exceptions that hang together in a coherent narrative. Whereas something that is fake or formulaic is a bunch of stuff you've seen before that hangs together in a coherent narrative, like a happy ending in a Hollywood movie. Or like a conspiracy theory or something like that, is a series of weird things that don't fit together, right? They jar with reality. And so the key to being a smart person is being able to embrace these unexpected events, these strange plot twists, but see how they can potentially cohere into an actual story. And so that is really, I think, the experience probably that almost anybody has in forming a friendship with another person, is you start talking with them and you start hearing their life story, and you're like, wait, what? That's bizarre. How is that the case? And then you realize your friend isn't lying. Your friend is telling you the truth, and that's rearranging your own brain sense of what is possible. And then the more you start to understand these, idiosyncratic, unique things about your friend, the more you start to understand what's unique about their character and who they are and what their story is, as opposed to having this kind of general generic impression of, oh, this person is just a kind of classic football player, or, oh, this person, is just a business type.
There's so much to say about that. The first thing is, I just think so much of our personal relationships and as friends and spouses and family members and employees, colleagues at work, it is just shaving off all the interesting parts of the narrative of both your own and other people's. So you don't reveal, you do have a narrative. It's plausible. As you say, people have heard it before, so you grab it when you're sharing your own emotions after a difficult experience or a challenge or trauma you had, but you hide. And as you say, with your closer friends or your spouse, ideally you don't hide. But even with your spouse and with your close friends and your children and parents, there's so much narrative experience that you've generated in the past from them that I think sometimes our brain just shuts off. And this is considered, ironically, a sign of intimacy. Oh, I know what she's going to say next. I know what he's feeling. I know them. But actually, you're treating them like an object. You're treating them like a screenplay, and you're not giving them the chance to break out and to have a story like you just told, which is extraordinary and interesting. And really, I mean, we could spend the rest of the time talking about that summer and what you're thinking and feeling, and it's really fascinating. But so just react to that. I'm going to ask you something else.
Yeah. You're missing the opportunity to discover something about this person.
Yeah.
that you're having a conversation with. And you're also missing the opportunity for them to discover something about you and for yourselves to discover something about yourselves together, which is the entire reason you get into a relationship, is for self-discovery and for discovery of somebody else. So super quick story on this. I got a phone call after I've been working with the operators for a while. I got this phone call from one of them, and he's like, Professor Fletcher. And I was like, yeah. He's like, we're having some problems. Specifically, we're having some problems with our wives. Or maybe our wives are having problems with us. It's not clear exactly what the origin of the problem is, but there's a problem there. And we're hoping that you can help us. And I'm like, what? What do you mean I can help you? And he's like, well, Professor Fletcher, because we trust you. We trust you. And what that means is that basically special operators, it's their whole job to trust nobody. They're the most classified units in the United States military. They don't trust anybody. And so the moment that they trust someone, that's like the only person they trust. So literally, I'm not kidding you. I could get a phone call next week from a special operator who's like, hey, Professor Fletcher, do you do open heart surgery? Because I really need some open heart surgery and I trust you, right? So you're like their guy. So I'm like, okay, wait, so you want me to talk to you about the problem you're having with your wife? No. We've got something much bigger than that. We've got about 100 couples that are about to get divorced in the special operations community, and we want you to work with them. And I'm like, what? And as I started to look into this, it turns out that these units have this incredibly high divorce rate, 80%, 90%. And
I am not surprised.
And so I'm like, all right, okay, what do I have to do? And they're like, don't worry, we'll take care of it. So again, I get picked up, get transported somewhere. Next thing I know, I find myself in a field. In the field are 100 special operators and their spouses. And, one of them comes up to me and he's like, Professor Fletcher, everyone in this field's about to get divorced unless you help them. So help them now. And I'm like, what? So what I did is I actually, after a moment of panic, I gave them back a technique that I'd learned from special operations. And that technique is a technique into how you surface exceptional information in somebody else. And basically the technique works by just suspending your judgment. And the way you do that is you ask the person who, what, when, where, how, but never why. You never ask them a why question. So, I might ask you, when was the first time, you went kayaking, and who did you go with, and who would you never go kayaking, and what did you bring with you, and these kinds of questions, but I would never ask you, why did you go kayaking? And because what that's allowing your brain to do is surface things that surprise you. Because, they might say, well, the one person I would never go kayaking with is my father. And then, of course, you want to say, well, why? Why would you never do that? But you can't, right? Instead, you've got to say, well, what else would you do with your father? And, what are activities, that your father likes to do? You know what I mean? This kind of thing. And you start to surface more information as opposed to jumping to a judgment. And so I gave the operators this exercise, these operators who were struggling with their spouses, just thinking it would kind of like buy me a little bit of time. They talked for hours. Because they were suspending these judgments, And I can't pretend that I saved every marriage in that field, but I can promise you that a lot of people came up to me afterwards and were like, that was the best conversation I've had with my spouse in a decade. And I just want everyone out there to know that the people in your life that you are making judgments about contain surprises that can change your life and can change their life. And by getting back in touch with that sort of childhood sense that every person out there is a mystery, every person is a wonder, you can not only make your relationships better, but you can discover a secret source of joy.
A couple things. First of all, you shouldn't have mentioned you're a screenplay writer in your past, because I'm wondering if any of these stories are true. They're very implausible, which makes them interesting, of course, because they're surprising. This 100 couple thing, it's a bit of a stretch, but I'm going to go with it. But I think, the idea, and you talk about this in a different context in the book, this interview thing, and just to make it, for those who haven't read the book yet, in the example in the book, the topic is your favorite activity, your favorite hobby, non-work activity. And I want to come back to this because it's an exercise you did with salespeople. But I think this idea of constraining yourself to not ask why is an extremely deep idea, because our brain, going back to this narrative theme, our brain loves narratives. And in that sense, I think economists are right, or at least the behavioral economists I think we're poking fun at a little bit earlier. We do like narratives, and it's one of our best skills. So we don't have all the information about anything. So we're constantly creating causal chains. And for me, I find this extremely interesting because I think our brain is desperately eager to find causation when there isn't causation. That's why, we say correlation isn't causation. People have a lot of trouble with that. They all know the line, but they have a lot of trouble internalizing it because The Latin fallacy is post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. That's a fallacy. After this doesn't mean it was caused by the thing that came before it, but it could be. And so when I'm talking to you about your hobbies, what is your favorite non-work activity, Ang?
Hanging out with special operators.
Okay. I was gonna grill you. But what's interesting about that is that when I'm in that conversation with you, my brain's constantly filling in the why. It's not so much asking the why, because I know why. Because you're like so and so, or that reminds me of the time of my love of hiking or cooking or whatever is the hobby. So I don't have to ask you why. I know why. But the idea that you can't ask why, I think it should be more than that. You can't ask why and you can't presume why. And that's how you learn. That's how you gather information about another human being. And what's fun is then you get a plot twist because you find out the reason they don't kayak with their father is some crazy thing that you'd never imagined. And the one you filled in, oh, he doesn't like his father. That's obvious. Big deal. That's fascinating.
Yeah, like, their father's best friend had drowned, and the father doesn't like water, and it's not a happy, safe place for the father. And so instead, I actually show my love for my father by not taking him on my favorite activity, right?
Yeah.
Something like that. And you're like, whoa, okay, didn't expect it. By the way, since you subtly accused me of possibly being a Russian agent who made up this story about giving, if your audience wants to Google Camp Homefront or Tom and Jen Satterley, you will discover, in fact, the truth of my marriage counseling story. So to your point about suspending why, we've done a ton of experiments with individuals in which we show that the driver of creativity is diversifying why. In other words, coming up with multiple explanations for why something could have occurred. And what we find is that most people, particularly in the modern world, struggle with this because they want to jump to what they think is the most probable why. So they'll always say, oh, you know what? This is what's most likely.
That's the AI. That's their algorithm. Right.
That's the algorithm, right? Yeah, this is one of the reasons, many reasons why I'm an enemy of AI, is because AI is all about jumping to the highest probability. And the highest probability is completely true if you exist inside a mathematical simulation. But if you exist inside the biological world, it's probably not true. And what we find with very successful scientists, successful entrepreneurs, successful artists, is they're able to come up with many, many possible explanations for a phenomenon. And the more you push yourself to do this in any situation, so if you're having a fight with your spouse, it's a good time to do this, your brain is immediately going to jump to an explanation as to, oh, they're doing this again, Try and come up with another explanation for their behavior. And then try and come up with another. And then and the more you do that, the more you'll find that your anger diminishes and your curiosity increases. And the more that your anger decreases and your curiosity increases, the more you'll be able to not only have a conversation with them, but the more you too will be able to create a new place for your relationship. And so just this simple skill of anytime you latch onto a why, saying to yourself, there are other possibilities. There is never in life 100% certainty about a cause, about why something happened. What is another explanation? What is another explanation?
Yeah, I often make this observation thinking about divorce. Why did they get divorced? People usually give a one-sentence answer, which we don't need to list them, but we can imagine them. It's usually extraordinarily complicated. It usually involves both parties. It's usually an interaction effect of something that bothers the other person or that was cruel or whatever it is. And causation's really difficult. Of course, all of life is multivariate. Which is frustrating because we like single on-off explanations. It's just it's the way we are.
Do we, though? I mean, I think we like surprise. I mean, I think actually the biggest joy in life is to discover that you were wrong about something in a way that opens up a whole area for you to explore. I mean, I think that's why both you and I became academics, isn't it? We didn't become academics because we wanted to be right. We became academics because we wanted to be surprised. We became academics because we had this kind of curiosity. And I think at the root of this is a misunderstanding of narrative. I think people think that narratives are about being true. There are right narratives and there are wrong narratives. Narratives are not about truth. Logic is about truth. Math is about truth. Narratives are about utility. And narrative is useful as if it accomplishes something for you. Now, if you're a malevolent autocrat, narratives are useful because it allows you to brainwash people into doing what you want them to do, right? But if you're an ordinary person, narratives are useful because they open up possibility in your life. They allow you to imagine different ways that things could be. And I think we spend a lot of time in our modern world using narratives for self-affirmation, which is another way of saying that I have stopped growing. I've decided that I'm going to stop growing because I like who I am and I need more reinforcement. Whereas the real value of narrative is to tell yourself a story that isn't true yet, but could be true. And so, a big part of what we see in children is children are constantly imagining possibilities that adults are constantly shutting down and being like, no, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. Yeah. And a lot of times children's narratives are wrong, right? But the impulse to create new narratives is right. And so as an adult, what you want to do is you want to maintain that impulse, even as you maintain your skepticism about narratives that are too easy or that are obviously magical.
Yeah, my problem with that, by the way, I half agree with you, which is nothing's more fun than a plot twist, right? We delight in the plot twist of a movie or in real life. If you had ended your story with the 100 couples, every single one of those couples got divorced. I can't figure it out. That's like, oh, wow, that's amazing in a bad way. But I think at the same time, so we do like surprises. And my, many of the things we're talking about, I write about in my book, Wild Problems. The uncertainty of the future is very hard for us. And I try to make the case in there that you don't want to go to a movie every time where you know what's going to happen. And part of what's fun about life is the uncertainty, or could be. You could imagine embracing the unpredictability of a career choice, or a personal choice, or a friendship choice, or a date, or coffee with a different kind of person than you usually see. And the unexpected happens and it's glorious. So often fun things happen for me when I accept an invitation that, someone will tell me, that's a waste of time. And I want to think, well, let's find out. It's a cheap date. It's a half an hour. It's an hour and a 75-minute coffee with a person who has an idea that they want me to possibly participate in. And yeah, most of the time it's not a good idea for me. But every once in a while, something magical can happen. And I love that. That's the plot twist. That's the unexpected. But at the same time, I think most people find that scary. They like control. And the plot twist means, whoa, we're off the rails. So I think a lot of regret in life comes from people who can't take the leap because I don't know what the plot's going to be. I don't like that. It makes me uncomfortable.
I think we agree completely. And I guess what I'm saying is I think we evolved as humans to be comfortable in uncertainty, and we have lost that comfort in the modern world. And I think the reason for that is because the modern world has focused on developing competency in certainty. So the whole idea of being a professional is to be able to optimize. And you can only optimize in stable environments. And so we have basically trained ourselves, really, I would say, since kind of like the mid-1950s, to focus more and more on exploiting stability. And that's what we become more and more competent in. But our brain evolved in incredibly uncertain environments. And all of our ancestors survived because they embraced those environments. The only way you survive in uncertainty is when you take risks. And I would submit to everybody that the happiest moments in their life came out of moments of uncertainty, when they took a chance and something interesting happened to them that they weren't expecting. And I would also submit to people that uncertainty is a lot more fun when you feel competent at it. In other words, when you feel like I can handle it, just like those special operations pilots we were talking about that invite uncertainty. Uncertainty is terrifying if you feel like I can't deal with this. And so in order to get back into embracing uncertainty, you need to go slowly. You don't just want to suddenly blow out the financial markets, set fire to your house, wander around like a kind of itinerant mendicant trying to survive in a brand new world. You want to start injecting little moments of uncertainty into your life and then being like, not only can I handle this, I kind of like this actually sort of opens things up for me. And then starting to revive that natural sense. And I will guarantee you, if you look at children are great in uncertainty. They like uncertainty. But we as adults crush that out by putting them into these school systems that teach them, habituate them regularity. And I just think that as a human being, it's important to remember that you can be good in stability. There's nothing wrong with stability. There's nothing wrong with optimization. There's nothing wrong with knowing that your home is there to come back to tonight. There's nothing wrong with all of these things. But also, the world is bigger than our ability to control. And so somehow, somewhere, you've got to develop your comfort and competence at dealing with those uncertain things. And realizing that the more that you do, the more you're going to open yourself to joy.
Some listeners will hear echoes of the episode with Michael Easter on the comfort crisis, where he makes some related points to this. And much of this book is consonant with the recent episode with David Bessis on his book Mathematica. So I encourage you, if you missed it, to listen to that, because your book is very much talks about the power of intuition. And most people think of intuition as irrational. It's your snap judgment. Bessis critiques Kahneman. He says, Kahneman says system one is the impulsive snap judgment embedded in your biology, your evolutionary brain. System two is your more rational, thoughtful, use the data, think about it more thoroughly. And Bessis argues that system three is where real thinking takes place, because your intuition is actually drawing on incredible amounts of data that you don't know consciously and experience that you've had. And when it clashes with system two, that's when you have a chance to hone your intuition. And that's very much consistent with what you're arguing.
Yeah, well, I also critique Kahneman. The only difference is that I think that intuition is a low information system. So I don't think your brain has kind of got all these Bayesian statistical networks, which are constantly crunching and finding information and kind of, cycling them down and using them to evaluate system one, system two, so on and so forth. What I think is that basically your brain evolved to notice things that don't fit its current understanding. It evolved to place a premium on surprise, because when something surprises you, that's the indication of possibly a new threat, but also possibly a new opportunity. And so I define intuition in the book, and the operators define intuition as the ability to spot exceptions. And then I say that out of intuition comes imagination, which is the ability to leverage those exceptions into possible new plans. And then I say that the human brain has got all these new plans proliferating. And then the question is like, which of these plans do you pick? And I say that, well, we've got two other low information systems that we can rely on. The first is common sense. Common sense helps us identify plans that are likely to work in our environment. How? Because common sense measures the uncertainty or the novelty of our environments. And the more new or uncertain our environment, the more there's a premium on trying a new plan. So in other words, your common sense is saying, hey, you've got all these imaginative plans. Some of them are less imaginative than others. If this is kind of a boring moment, use a less imaginative one. If this is a surprising moment, use the more imaginative one. And then the final low information system is emotion. And emotion is kind of your way of tracking which of these plans works best for you. So you're not just succeeding in the world, you're also succeeding in the world in a way that fits your own life story, your own life narrative.
It's surprising that you consider emotion as a form of intelligence. You write about anger and fear. And there's a lot of interesting ideas in the book. We can't go into them, thoroughly. But a lot of what burdens us is our past and our presumption that either the future will be like it or it won't be because I just got lucky that time. And you write very thoughtfully about the roles that anger and fear play. So say something about that.
Yeah. So, we're just taught that somehow emotion is dumb and we've got to learn to dissociate from it or compartmentalize from it or focus away from it. Shut it down. Right. Exactly. And it's like, no, emotion can't possibly be dumb. It's the most ancient part of our brain, and it also remains the most powerful part of our brain. So that's telling you that it's really smart, and we must be using it wrong. And the reason we're using it wrong is we don't understand what it's doing. And really what it's doing is it's signaling to us the state of our own inner narrative. And so a simple example of this I talk about in the book is anger and fear. Your brain is a bias to action, so it always wants to have a plan. And ideally, it always wants to have multiple plans because those multiple plans allow flexibility. When your brain starts feeling fear, that's because your brain is saying, I don't have a plan that I believe in. I don't have a plan that I believe in. And why is fear the emotion that your brain has evolved to signal this? Well, because fear makes you susceptible to outside influence. When you're scared, you're more likely to do what other people suggest. We've all had this experience when we get nervous and we turn to other people for counsel. And so what's happening there is our brain has evolved the mechanism in fear that allows us to maintain our bias to action by taking a plan from somebody else. So we never sit there helplessly. We're always doing something because we're borrowing that plan from somebody else. Now, that's not to say that taking that plan from somebody else is smart, right? It leads to herd behavior, leads to a lot of problems. But the signal itself of the fear is good. Because when you learn to recognize that fear is telling me I don't have a plan, I'm becoming susceptible, that's encouraging you to kick on your initiative and say, let me start taking back control, figure out a new plan. And I talk about in the book how to do that. What is anger signaling? Anger is signaling that you have exactly one plan. You have exactly one plan. Now, why anger? Why is anger associated with that? Well, because what our brain has learned is that the more assertively you act a plan, the more likely it is to work. And you see this all the time in your own life. If you act something hesitantly, it's less likely to work. If you act it assertively, it's more likely to work. And so if you only have one plan, your brain is like, we got to go hard on this plan because this is it. Now, again, that's smart. It is true if you've only got one plan, you should go hard at it. But the smarter thing to do is come up with a second plan, right? And a third plan, so you increase your flexibility. And so again, anger is smart, but what's really smart is learning to read the signal underneath the anger and say to yourself, okay, now it's time to come up with another plan. And I go through a lot of emotions in the book, and I kind of explain how they all work in this way and how we're all sort of misunderstanding them in the modern world.
So you're saying that I've got this plan. It might be a shortcut, let's say, to the parking lot of some event I'm going to. And that shortcut, turns out the road doesn't go through, or there's a lot of traffic on the shortcut that I didn't anticipate or wasn't on the phone when I looked at it. And my reaction to that's going to be anger? Is that an example?
Yeah, well, it could be exactly, because then what's going to happen is you're going to get angry. You're like, I got to force this shortcut, right? And then you notice this with people, they start like inching closer to the car ahead of them, as if somehow they can like force their way through traffic, right? Aggression. Or you know what? They give up. They give up and they're like, you know what, I got to call somebody for help, this, that, and the other thing. When in reality, of course, what a special operator would do, and this happens all the time, and special operations is all about you're driving in some city you don't know, and then all of a sudden you realize you're trapped. All of a sudden it's like, well, what are the other 500 things I could possibly do in this moment? Including just say to myself, do I even need to get out of here early? I mean, is that even that big a deal? There's all sorts of ways your brain can handle that and come up with a new plan, And so just being able to diagnose, I'm getting angry now. That's telling me that I've only got one plan. And so what I'm going to just keep doing is keep trying to force that plan harder. And back to our earlier conversation, one of the areas that this is most significant is not driving, but interpersonal communication. How many times in your life do you find yourself getting angry at somebody else? And the reason you find yourself
it never happens to me. Ask my friends, ask my wife. I never get angry. Well, Chill, that's my middle name.
Unfortunately, maybe I don't always get angry all the time, but I definitely get irritated with other people. In fact, I get irritated with a lot of other people quite a lot. And what that's basically telling you is you've run out of communication strategies, man. What's happening here is you just think if I repeat myself louder, the other person's going to understand my position, right? When in reality, it's like, let me back up, think about how this person is thinking about the situation. Let me find other ways to communicate. Let me find other ways to explain. Now, is it possible that this other person and I do have a genuine disagreement and it has to eventually go into a kind of, fight to the death and one of us has to kill the other and decapitate them? There's a small possibility of that in any situation. But most of the time, it comes down to actually revising your communication strategy, listening to the other person, realizing that there are other ways to negotiate this. And so anytime you get angry in your personal relationships, just remind yourself, this is because I think there's only one way here. And there probably isn't. There's probably another way to communicate.
So I want to disagree with it a little bit, or maybe I need to reinterpret the way I think about this. I'm always fascinated by, I'll get angry. I was kidding before, just for the record. I'll get angry. And at some point I realize I'm not angry at the other person. I'm angry at myself. I've either messed up. I need an excuse so that I don't blame myself. So I need to blame someone else. It could be in a work situation. I've failed to anticipate a problem. The problem arises and I think, well, of course, that's not my fault. I don't have any faults. That fault must be so-and-so's fault. And someone will sometimes say to me, a family member when I'm discussing it, that's your failure that you didn't prepare so-and-so for success, or you didn't give them the tools they needed, or you didn't trust them enough, or you didn't put them in a situation where they could succeed. And boy, do I hate to hear that because it hurts, right? So how does that fit in with the one plan thing? Or does it?
Well, I actually think we agree again, Russ, unfortunately. This may be because I'm obtuse, but I think we agree because I think that when you hear that from someone, that you're getting angry because, you're really getting angry yourself, I think you probably have a moment of resistance about that. But then when you accept it, your anger goes away because all of a sudden you realize, oh, there's another path here. right? Yeah. There's another opportunity here. And what that is really saying to you is anger. So anger is always part of our fight or flight response. Anger and fear are the two parts of our fight or flight response. And that's because there's a threat that we perceive. And, the main form of threat we perceive is other people, but sometimes the threat we perceive a lot of times is ourselves. I'm not good enough, right? You know what I mean? I'm the problem, And then, if the threat is me, like I'm doomed, right? Because, there's a problem that can't be fixed. And so to hear from somebody else giving us counsel, no, there is actually another way. You're better than this. You can see this, you can do these other things. That actually relieves us because it makes us realize, going back to what I was saying earlier, we can grow, we can evolve, we can become a better person.
You write, quote, optimism is widely understood as the belief this will succeed. But that's not optimism, it's wishful thinking. Wishful thinking is an age-old delusion glamorized in modern times by a method known as visualizing success, close quote. And then you, I think, write later, maybe just follows it. Happily, however, you can still live in optimism because optimism isn't this will succeed. Optimism is much, much stronger. Optimism is this can succeed. Why is can stronger than will? Why is can succeed stronger than will succeed? Continuing the quote. Well, if you tell yourself that you will win and you don't, your confidence will crack. But if you tell yourself that you can win, then you'll retain the faith. No matter how many times you lose, as long as you win once. That one time is all you need to keep possibility alive, which is why can lives on long after will has shattered.
That's right. And we figured this out by discovering something or probing something that's known as the optimism paradox, which is that people who claim to be very optimistic actually are not that optimistic. And also, people often say, well, optimism is better for you. Optimism, it inclines you more likely to success. Well, if that's the case, how come so many of us are not optimistic, right? If optimism always leads to success, you would think there'd be an evolutionary selection pressure. And it turns out we're doing optimism wrong, man. We're doing it wrong. We're taught that optimism is convincing ourselves that something will work. That's magical thinking because there's no way you have of knowing that something will work, right? I mean, we've just talked this entire podcast about how uncertainty. And then the moment you convince yourself, this will work, you go listen to Tony Robbins or one of these folks, and you get yourself all amped up. This will work. I'm going to manifest. I'm going to keep throwing my positive energy into the positive wishing well, and it's all going to come true. The more you do that, and then it doesn't work, your entire faith is shattered because you're like, I did everything right and it didn't work. You know what? I guess I got to give up, and you descend into true pessimism. Whereas actual optimism is realizing, look, nothing's guaranteed to work, but a lot of things could work. And the way you remind yourself of genuine optimism is you look back in your own past at all the risks you took that worked and all the times that you tried something new and it panned out. Now, maybe it didn't pan out perfectly. Maybe you didn't get everything out of it that you wanted, but you got something out of it. And so when we discovered this, we do this all the time working with the operators because the operators, the special operators, they'll literally just end up in some situation where they're having live hand grenades tossed on them. They'll have people standing 20 feet away from them with a suicide vest. That the vest goes off, everybody dies. Again and again, they're in these situations. And the operators just never give up. They keep going, right? They never fall into kind of pessimism. And we're like, how is this possible? And it's because they have memories in their past when they were in these really hard situations and they kept going and it worked out. So they're always like, it's always possible. It could happen. And that is actually optimism. Optimism is the realization that a lot of improbable things happen all the time. And you only get to experience them if you hang in there. So, if you don't have a second plan, hang in there with the plan you've got. But also, as you're hanging in there, take a little time, come up with some other plans. Maybe one of those plans could work. That's optimism.
We haven't had a chance to talk about it. It's important. Talk about now plus one.
So now plus one is a technique that the operators gave me to help with a problem in the modern world that we know as anxiety. And so in the modern world, we've been taught that anxiety is a bad thing. We're taught that we have to practice mindfulness and dissociation and so on and so forth. Anxiety is one of the smart parts of your brain. Anxiety evolved in the human brain to detect unknown unknowns, or in other words, to detect the volatility of your environment. That's why when your anxiety is working properly, you get a sudden nervous sense that something isn't quite right. And by turning anxiety into a problem and by trying to eliminate it from our brains through all these various sort of techniques, we're eliminating that connection to reality. We're eliminating that ability that our brain has naturally to detect when things are getting a little funny right now. And we've got to start responding to that funniness. We can't just kind of turtle and just hope that things go away or wait for somebody to come to save us. We've got to act. We've got to act with initiative. And so anxiety is good. The problem is that in the modern world, we're not using anxiety appropriately. And so the operators gave me a couple simple techniques to tune anxiety. The first is a lot of our anxieties, it turns out, come from our past. So we're worried that something that has already happened to us is going to repeat itself in the future. When we have that worry, what that's telling us is we haven't learned from the past because the problem isn't going to repeat itself if we've changed in some way to stop it from repeating itself. So the first thing the operators do is they go through all their past worries and they fix them, essentially. But then the next thing they do is they say, once I've cleared my past, I start to ask myself, how far into the future can I look without feeling unproductive anxiety? And the reason they ask themselves this is because the future is the definition of an unknown unknown. So the further you look into the future, the more your anxiety is naturally going to spike. And so what they say is, in a stable environment, like if I'm going to shop for bananas in my local supermarket, I can look pretty far into the future, all the way to the checkout, and I'm not going to experience any anxiety, right? Because there's just nothing new or interesting here, you know? But if I'm in a fast-changing, volatile environment, if I try and look a minute ahead, 5 minutes ahead, 10 minutes ahead, I'm going to panic. And so instead of looking that far ahead, what I want to do is I want to look to the now plus one, to the task that's ahead of me that I can control. And the more that I focus on that immediate future, the more my anxiety is going to be productive in the sense that I'm going to have a little bit of a sense of a buzz that's keeping me vigilant and alert, but I'm not going to be overwhelmed by all the different options that could happen, such that my mind can't plan effectively. There's that bad word again, plan. So the idea behind the now plus one is you're always pushing your attention forward. So you're not practicing mindfulness or presentness. You're always living slightly in the future because you have a narrative brain, and that's where your brain is supposed to be living. But you're always pushing it just far enough into the future that your anxiety is keeping you vigilant and productive, as opposed to trending into panic and sort of manic apprehension.
I want to close. Let's close with your favorite writer, who is clearly William Shakespeare. I was about 2/3 of the way through the book, and I made a note to myself, maybe the main lesson of this book is to read more Shakespeare. And then I get a little further into the book, and it's all, you even have a place where you sort of stop and say, let me talk about all the places I mentioned Shakespeare in the book already. And Shakespeare was a genius. I think most people would say Shakespeare was a genius because he could use words unlike anyone else. If you go to the Globe Theatre in London, there's a poster. I think it's a display. Maybe it's also a poster of all the expressions in the English language are, the top 50 that Shakespeare coined, that we use all the time, and we don't think about that they're Shakespeare. All the wordplay, all the memorable aphorisms. He was an amazing poet / wordsmith. But that's not what you emphasize in the book. And you could have written this book as this. Maybe you'll write this book. Maybe it's your next book. What Shakespeare could teach us about how to live wisely, or how to make decisions, or how to lead, or how to manage, or how to plan. But that's the next book. But there's a lot of Shakespeare in here. So talk about why you like Shakespeare, how he influenced many, many great creatives besides other playwrights, other authors, and why it's useful to read him.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I didn't love Shakespeare when I was younger because I was forced to read him in school. So I didn't like him like everything I was forced to do in school. But then I started to discover all these people who I admired and respected credited Shakespeare. And so, whether it's Vincent van Gogh or Marie Curie or Albert Einstein or Nikola Tesla or Clausewitz, Steve Jobs, there's a whole list of them in the book. And they all credit Shakespeare. And the reason for that ultimately, as I talk about in the book, is because Shakespeare embodies this primal intelligence that we've been talking about. He has this ability to spot exceptions then double down on those exceptions and turn them into new stories. Classic exception would be Hamlet. Hamlet is a thinker in an action story. You don't put a thinker in an action story, right? You don't get any action. This play's been going on for 4 hours. We haven't had anything occur, you know? But that's where the interesting stuff happens. And Hamlet himself says, as a stranger, give it welcome. In other words, the odder that something is, the more you should embrace it into your life. And Shakespeare has this whole habit of going around the world and saying, what's different? What's new? What's surprising? How can I use that to generate a fresh story? Because a fresh story is a fresh plot. It's a fresh plan. So I became totally fascinated with this. And I discovered that the more I forced the operators to read Shakespeare and engage with Shakespeare, the better they got at running special operations. And the same thing with business people. And I could spend hours and hours and hours and hours kind of explaining the science of this and sort of breaking down Shakespeare and how to use them. But the reality is just read them. Just read Shakespeare. Your first experience will be, this is really hard. This is really weird. I don't know what's going on here. But then the more you start to read Shakespeare and the more you start to read Shakespeare on your own, the more you will find your brain having surprising thoughts, surprising imaginations, and getting back in touch with its kind of root intelligence. So yes, much in the same way that I've been converted to Army Special Operations, I've also been converted to reading Shakespeare.
Actually, I want to ask you one more question. There's a couple answers, not answers, reword that. There are a couple of examples in the book of journaling, and in particular, writing stories. You could have written about writing poetry. It's an interesting exercise that I know people use sometimes with groups of young people who think, quote, I'm not a poet, or they think poetry's too hard, so I can't do that. But most of us can write a story, even a bad story. And a lot of, in the examples, there's a huge therapeutic effect of story writing. And I wondered if it was oversold. The two examples that I remember from the book are salespeople who have to go into, this is a beautiful exercise, you go into a art museum and you see a painting and you have to imagine what came beforehand that got us to that moment. It's a beautiful example of, working on your narrative imagination. But you also talk about it literally as a therapeutic exercise for people who are despondent, depressed, feel their life's purposeless, and some of them snap out of it after writing a story. It's a little hard to believe. It happens to appeal to me because I love narrative and I love creatives and I love storytelling and I love writing stories. And I deeply believe that EconTalk, to the extent it helps people or affects them, it comes from hearing a story, hearing narratives from our conversation and so on. So talk about journaling and story writing for people who aren't authors, who aren't playwrights, who aren't screenwriters.
Yeah, and I share your skepticism because honestly, a lot of journaling doesn't work. And a lot of these narrative exercises don't work. The point I make in the book is that they can work. And what's really interesting is understanding why it is that they can work and why it is when they do work, they have these profound conversion effects. And, there's too much of us to sort of go into here. But in the case of the salespeople, that is about a bunch of salespeople who were burnt out. They were once top salespeople, but they'd lost their ability at sales. And that simple narrative that reminded them of what they had been as a young salesperson who'd been excited, who'd been curious, kind of get back in touch with their primordial self, was enough to re-spark their existing ability. So if you were an inexperienced salesperson, that exercise wouldn't have done a lot for you, but because they were experienced salespeople, it did. And the same thing with writing out your narrative of yourself. I think it's a lot of times we do this incorrectly. A lot of times we just sit down and journal thoughts that occur to us. What you actually have to sit down is go back through your life for what I would call a conversion moment, a moment of wonder, a moment where you had either through your own behavior, surprised yourself to an extraordinary degree, or the world surprised you to an extraordinary degree, where you felt like something akin to like a miracle. Those kinds of stories, once you have them, you hold them in your mind, you can then use them to revisit negative experiences in your life. Because your mind has stored a whole bunch of these negative experiences in terms of grief and shame that are interfering with your current ability to think. And by going back to those and starting to process them from the perspective of these miracle narratives that because you experienced them yourself. You didn't get them from some self-help book. A lot of times people now, when they're looking for inspiration, they turn to somebody else's life. The moment you do that, it's over because your brain's like, oh, that's another person's life. But if something really miraculous happened to you in your own life, you believe it because you experienced it, and you can then use it to process grief, shame, all these other things. And so, as I talk about in the book, it's not going to happen for everybody, and it does require work, but it can happen. And, the most important story in life is the story you tell yourself about yourself. So any time you invest in making sure that that story is honest and also going in the direction you want, is time well spent.
My guest today has been Angus Fletcher. The book is Primal Intelligence. Angus, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
It's been a huge pleasure, Russ. Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.